Okay, so welcome to the Predicting Better podcast. This is a very special episode for two reasons. Yeah, two reasons. One, the first one is our first one, and we look forward to many more. But the really special reason is our guest today is Mark Miller, who has an amazing pedigree in the predictive processing framework and predictive mind. And we're so grateful to have Mark. It's taken a few attempts, but we finally got him here, which is amazing. Yeah. And Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, Tony, thanks so much. Wow, what a privilege to be the first guest. I mean, I feel what a privilege, really.
I'm so honored to have you, Mark. And when I introduce you, people understand why. And Mark he's got a PhD in this framework. He's been studying this for years. He's worked at, I think, University of Sussex, Hokkaido, and now he just told me he's just got a position in Monash to do some amazing things. So we'll ask him more about that later. But the wonderful thing is Mark has actually looked at both sides of the predictive framework. Yeah, this predictive brain that gives us such an opportunity to help our clients to get free of distress, to break free of their symptoms and their issues, and actually restore flourishing and restore well-being. And Mark has looked at both sides of this equation. He's looked at emotions, Mark, addictions, compulsions. He's looked at fear and pain, depersonalization. He's looked at trust and how we construct ourselves. But so importantly, he's looked at the dynamics of happiness and flourishing and well-being. And so we really want to unpack all of those amazing things. And if we can do it in an hour, that would be amazing. So, Mark, I want to welcome you to this show. Thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks so much. And it's cool. It's cool speaking with someone like yourself too, because something that I really I want to see happen is that we take some of these things out of the armchair and we take them off of the whiteboard, and we start thinking about some of the ways that this rethinking of the cognitive architecture and of what pathology might be and what well-being might be, and then seeing if it can actually come into the world and make positive impacts. So I love to hear you say already as a practitioner that this is being converted in a way that's actually helping people's lives. And that's huge for me.
Mark, this framework, and this is why I feel this podcast and this mission is so important, and the mission you're on as well, is this understanding of the brain just provides so much explanatory power, such rich explanatory power to unify so many of these things. Compulsions, addictions, depersonalization, fear, pain, and well-being. Yeah. It unifies the whole thing, which I feel has been missing from the mental health and mental illness approaches, from the psychotherapy approaches that they've kind of been siloed and schools. But this framework just goes across all of it and provides this amazing way of understanding the brain, understanding issues, and giving us tools now to work with those, right? Because we really have the nuts and bolts of this. It's a model that we haven't had before, Mark. Yeah. So look, there's so much to unpack here, but I'd really love to start with your journey, Mark. Just a little, brief story of how you came to this point. How you came into this predicting world, and what brought you? What was happening in your life before that brought you into this?
Yeah. Well, I did my undergraduate in philosophy at University of Toronto, and I was always interested in philosophy of cognitive science. So that's really theoretical cognitive science, right? Thinking about what the role that a philosopher can play on a team of cognitive scientists is the theoretical role, reading the literature and trying to decide maybe which way the framework can go. I was working, my senior advisor was Evan Thompson, and he's at UBC now. And I remember I had a meeting with him just as I was finishing my undergraduate, and he said, well, what are you going to do next? And I said, well, I really want to study consciousness and I want to study selfhood, but I keep bumping up against these hard science edges because, of course, I had a philosophy background. He said, well, the thing to do is you got to find somewhere interdisciplinary to do a degree. He said, a really great place is University of Edinburgh. They've got this amazing flagship master's. It's completely interdisciplinary. Philosophers can go in and then they can take neuroscience and psychology and neurobiology and cognitive science and computer science and artificial intelligence. You can basically build a degree, and anybody can come into that interdisciplinary degree from any of those angles and take all of the neighboring fields that crowd around what is cognition, what is language, what is selfhood. And I remember so clearly, he just leaned over and he said that the head of the department is Andy Clark. And I'll just shoot him an email right now because I know Andy, and I'll just tell him, look out, I've got a sharp student who's going to be applying for a master's. And he did it right there. And I got accepted, and Andy was my co-supervisor for my master's. When I finished my master's, of course, Andy Clark is a big deal in the predictive processing world. He's sort of one of the pillars of the community.
He's so even in my uncertainty as well.
That's right, exactly. Surfing uncertainty. So in 2010 already, I was starting to work on these things with Andy. I took a couple of years off and I came back for a PhD with Andy again. And so I stayed 4 years with Andy working through my ideas there. And I did my dissertation on predictive processing and embodied cognition, thinking about what role the body played in these predictive dynamics, and especially what role emotion played. So I think you can see there why that goes into pathology and flourishing, because as soon as we're talking about emotion, we're talking about how emotion can break down and how it can be supported.
That's it, Mark. And I think what's coming out of this framework, and we're going to work our way through this, but what's coming out of this framework is how the brain is so connected into the body in the way that has to explain the senses coming from the body. It has to relate to what's going to happen to the body in the environment that is surrounding us, anticipating those needs in that environment and working from that. So, I don't know whether we're going to start with a flourishing or how it works well, and maybe start from there. How does the system work? Let's unpack some of this prediction framework, so that we can then get our head around some of these sort of, when it does go a bit off, we can start to understand what's going off in those. Yeah, is that a good place to start, do you think?
Sounds good to me. Did you want to do a little bit of basic framework stuff, or should we just jump straight into where it goes wrong?
Let's get a little bit of basic framework on the table so people have an idea what's going on in the brain. Because when you talk about prediction machine, the brain's a prediction machine, it's predictive processing. It brings up ideas that it's just trying to predict the future, or it's coming up with some idea, but it's actually doing something a little bit different to that, right? It's not a logical prediction. It's not a cognitive prediction. It's predicting the senses, right, as a proxy for the world. So maybe explaining a bit of that, because it then explains how it can go well and how it can go wrong. That sounds okay?
So yeah, that's good. So in a nutshell, the sort of exciting and the provocative, I think what's really provocative about this framework is that it essentially flips the traditional framework on its head. I mean, that's a little bit too easy because it's not so black and white. It's not so much of a cartoon, but I think that is a nice way to think about what's exciting about this framework. So traditionally, we thought that the brain primarily was processing information that it was getting from the world in a largely bottom-up fashion. Now, of course, we've known that there's been top-down and bottom-up dynamics for a tick now, but still we emphasize this idea that we were getting information from the world and getting information from the body, and that the brain was largely constructing or decoding or processing that information in a sort of from simple and low up through complex and high.
Building up features building up features.
Exactly, right. Right, you got it. And then the end result is your sort of experience of the world. Yeah. And what this framework proposes is that you can essentially flip that upside down. Rather than thinking of the brain as largely a passive organ that's waiting around for data in order to process in this bottom-up sort of fashion, the brain is potentially the brain and the nervous system, and maybe even parts of the body, or maybe the whole body, depending on who we're talking to, because that's still up for debate. Like how much of it is a prediction machine. I tend, just as a side note, I tend to think the whole thing is the prediction machine, but we can come back to that. What it does, rather than waiting around for signals, is it takes everything it has learned about the statistical regularities of an environment and the statistical regularities of how its own body works, and indeed the statistical regularities of how it tends to predict. And it uses this generative model, to make guesses about what's going to happen or what these signals mean from the top down, so that experience is no longer this brick by brick being built from the bottom up, but rather experience turns out to be our brain's best guess from the top down, what's going on in the world based on how it's been in the past. And I mean, that's a really spooky idea if you catch it.
And Mark, one important part of this, I feel, is so critical for understanding when it goes wrong. like you said, it's under the brain's predicting the world, but because it's trapped in a black box, there's no light gets into here. There's no sound gets in, right? It's all electrochemical signals through the nerve pathways. So the brain only has the senses, right? The senses
Right.
are what it's constructing and predicting, yeah?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not actually predicting the world, right? It's predicting its beliefs about the world based on the senses, yeah?
Yeah.
Exactly. That is where I think that's the key to it going wrong and going right, yeah?
Well, yeah. And, and it's spooky. I mean, it gives me a spooky feeling if I really push that in my own experience. So, I mean, it means that you might, I mean, there's a couple of different ways of describing this. But one way that you could describe it that, is a bit spooky is that you're not really seeing the world. You're not seeing the world out there. What you're seeing is your own top-down hallucination of what you expect the world to be. And that's really what you're perceiving. So you're not seeing light from the world. You're only using the light to update your own hallucination about what the world is like. And that's, okay. Now, not everyone's going to agree with that. Okay. The people who are like deep in the embodied camp, they're not going to want to buy this idea that the brain is completely locked away. Because one of the things the embodied cognitive science people want to get on board is that the brain, body, and world are flowing in certain sorts of extended dynamics that you can start thinking about cognition cut at different places.
Right.
So not everyone's gonna love this point. But I still think I think it's still a worthy place to point something that's kind of interesting. I like that point because it means that if the world that you're experiencing isn't satisfactory to you, if something feels like it's not right, it may not be the world that's the problem. And it may not even be your own body that's the problem, but rather the network of beliefs that you've installed and had installed, it's generating your experience. And for me, that's a really empowering insight, because it means that if I don't like the world I live in, there might be something I can change on the inside that will actually change the sort of experience that I'm having on the outside.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I've heard you talk about this in your TED talk and a few other things where you talk about a person on a bus and they can be on exactly the same bus, but the experience is totally different, right? Top-down sort of processing of the information coming in and the experience they've had in the past and how that forms the predictions they're making. Yeah.
So like we've had that idea for a long time. I mean, it's folk, right? I mean, optimists live in a sort of different world than a pessimist. But the kind of cool thing of this cognitive architecture is they literally experience a different world. Like it's not like their experience is biased. It's not that. It's much stronger than that. It's that the actual world they live in is phenomenologically different. So Lisa Feldman Barrett has written such a sharp paper called "When a Gun Isn't a Gun" in the New York Times. And she was reporting on, this sort of string of shootings in America where police officers had shot African-American men who they thought had guns, and it turned out that they had a pager or they grabbed their belt or something else. And folk wisdom says either they're lying, they're just racists who did something bad and now they're covering it up, or they confabulated, they did it, and then after the fact, their memory got reformatted. But actually from this framework, there's a third possibility that opens up that's interesting, and I think it's important to consider, and that is, in a particular context, given a noisy data set, it's possible they saw a gun, and that's sort of what the brain is doing all the time. It's filling in the gaps. It's taking noisy data, that's what it was evolved to do, and then giving you the best possible vision that keeps you alive. So, we're literally hallucinating our reality.
And for what you're saying, it's not built for accuracy. It's built for sort of that responsiveness. Yeah. And the sort of expectations you're talking about, the expectations in that stimulus or scenario the person's in, there's incoming information that is priming the brain for a certain action. And as Lisa talks about, that action then feeds back to what they're going to see. And there's a whole interplay in her book,
Yeah.
7.5 Lessons on the Brain, right? And it's amazing. I don't know if you read that one, but
Yeah.
but this whole framework now explains that, right, as a top-down expectation. But that then gives us a really powerful framework for projections, and
Right.
we see working with
Right.
clients, and in our world around us, for confirmation bias, all these things have so much sense in this framework. They're clearly explained as functions of the brain from predicting the senses based on your past experience and those beliefs that have been formed. So, are there any other parts of the this sort of predictive puzzle, do you think, to get on the table? And
Yeah.
to say,
Yeah. The big one is feelings. This takes up a lot of my research over the last,
tell me.
well, kind of the last 10 years, really.
Yeah.
So when we first started thinking about emotion in predictive processing terms, we started sort of thinking it along the same lines as extraception. So we thought, well, look, extraception is we're taking data from the world, that's the prediction error, and there's top-down predictions about what the source of those errors are, and sort of when the error and the prediction meet sufficiently, then we have an extraceptive experience.
Yeah. So Mark, can you just prediction error? Yeah, prediction error is an important one in this framework.
Yeah, sure.
Can we just take a moment, continue that train of thought, but just take a moment to unpack what prediction error is, so that
exactly.
people know, because
so the brain,
this audience possibly hasn't heard of prediction error before. So if you can unpack that, because that's a key to this whole framework, right? That prediction error.
Right. So the brain makes a first sort of just guess relative to the raw data. And wherever there's a discrepancy between what the brain expects to happen next and what actually happens next, being driven by the data itself.
And that data is the sensory input, right? That's the sensory.
Exactly. Right. So an error is produced, and the error really is the hero of the story, because according to the framework, the error is what pushes forward in the system, and it recruits better predictions. And then whatever's divergent still pushes forward in the system, which recruits a better prediction until you have a sufficiently good predictive grip between the driving signal and the top-down prediction.
Right. So I've heard you talk about a predictive crunch before, and this crunch is going on. It's the brain is trying to reduce that prediction error. Those errors are flowing up.
Right.
As it basically can explain sensory motor, or it can explain different parts of the sensory input. Those essentially almost get thrown away in a way. Is that right? Like
they get resolved. They get resolved.
Resolved, and the top down becomes the experience. The top down expectation.
That's right. That's right. You got it.
So if you talk about the police officer before seeing a gun, the error didn't actually get resolved, right? The pager wasn't seen and the error wasn't resolved. The top down became so strong, it projected into the world. Is that sort of a fair way to put it?
That's right. Right. So one thing that this system is good at, it optimizes, it's really efficient at optimizing how much of its predictions or how much of the raw signal it's using at any one point in time. That's a bit of a cartoon, but it's nice enough for what we're saying now. So meaning, if the signal is particularly noisy, then the system will tend to use top-down predictions more heavily. It'll weigh the top-down predictions as more certain than the raw sensory data. So an easy example is if you're walking home on a familiar path in the fog, now the visual data itself is extremely noisy. You can't see very well. So what the system will do is it will actually turn the volume up on your memory of walking along this path in order to fill in the gaps. And it'll turn down the volume on how much you're using evidence gleaned from the world, because right now it's particularly noisy.
And Mark, this turning up and turning down, just to show how important that, when you studied depersonalization, there were parts of the network that got turned up and turned down. So we'll get to that in a moment, right? I think that's important to get to that in a moment. But just before we get there, I think you were talking about the interoception. Is that right? You're getting to interoception. You're talking about extraception, interoception.
Exactly.
The body. Yeah, and we just get that on the table. Now we've got a really good framework now, I think, for.
Exactly. So when we first started thinking about emotion, we thought it would be just like extraception. So the only difference being is that we were making top-down predictions about data coming from inside of the body rather than from outside of the body. And the sorts of predictions that we were making were predictions about feelings and pain and interoceptive experiences. So that was our first blush. And it did sufficiently well. I think it's probably right to some degree. But it was pretty quick that researchers like Lisa Feldman Barrett and Mika Allen, these are affective neuroscientists, they started proposing that probably the emotional predictions or interoceptive predictions were probably going to play a special role in the predictive hierarchy, because the thing we want to predict most is to stay alive. So the signals that are keeping us alive, they should be somehow central to how the rest of the predictions are working. So everything has this sort of gravitational attraction to the interoceptive predictions, or the interoceptive predictions might be closer to the center of a hierarchy of predictions.
So those feelings coming through the vagal system,
exactly,
heart rate,
right.
We're talking about digestion,
right.
or gut
right.
motility.
Right.
We're talking about sort of all those sort of the internal milieu, that whole sort of those signals where you're saying those are on a pedestal in the brain, right? Those are
right. So
yeah.
I'm not sure if it's Lisa Feldman Barrett who says this, but I know I've definitely read it in her work. I don't know if she coined it, but the feelings are like a pacemaker in the brain, keeping everything else in its frequency and its wave. Wow. So I like that. And there's a lot of good work, especially by Mika Allen and Manos Tsakiris. They've done just fantastic work on this. And Anil Seth, of course. But more recently, and this is what I'm especially interested in, a new layer of the role that feeling plays in the predictive system has begun to emerge. And that is that feelings aren't only going to be the result of top-down predictions about what's going on in the body, but feelings, some subset of feelings, particularly we've been looking at valence, so feeling good and feeling bad, these tones of positive tones and negative tones, that actually they're playing a role as a kind of second order form of information. Meaning, depending on how well we're doing at predicting and how well we're doing at resolving error, feelings are showing up as part of the tuning system that makes sure that when we do better than expected at reducing error, then the system learns quick that that's the kind of thing to sort of stay fascinated with. And when we do worse than expected at reducing prediction error, then the negative feelings that come up tend to sort of push us away, or tend for us to learn that maybe that's not the best, it's not the best niche to be visiting right now, given our skills. So this has opened up a whole new sort of way of thinking about feelings and predictive processing, not only top-down predictions, but about how well we're predicting.
Yeah, and I love that, Mark. I love that because, emotions, there's always been a struggle to understand the source or how it fits together. But now through this predictive processing framework, we've got a really good handle, as you said, on subsets of emotions, on valences and arousal levels, and how they link into this prediction system, right? So within this model, and this is why I feel it's so important, within this model, we've got thoughts and cognitions and beliefs well explained. We've got emotions really well explained. And as we're going to see, we get behaviors really well explained, right? They all make so much sense in this framework. As you said, the emotions just drop out of this thing, and they just are so clear that, it's how you're doing in the world actually feeds back in this system. And so from here, let's look at some of this. I feel like we've kind of got a nice little framework, and it's going to grow from here. But let's look at some of the work you've done in the pathology side, because this is what's going to be interesting to people working with fear or pain or addictions, compulsions. People working in mental illness or working as a coach, trying to make a difference or make a change. And should we pick one of those? What's kind of top on your list? What are some of the areas?
actually so we've done work now, like Julian Kiverstein and Eric Reichfeld, both at the University of Amsterdam, and myself and a couple of other people. We've been working on a lot of different sort of looking at how this cognitive architecture might be applicable to thinking about psychopathology. So we've looked at depression, addiction, anxiety, dissociative disorders, OCD.
Yes. So
I'm really interested in PTSD right now is another one I'm interested in.
right. Yeah. Trauma is a big one. So yeah. What were you going to say? Yeah.
But well, actually, rather than pick any one in particular,
yes.
Let me tell you what I've started thinking about after doing this for 5 or 6 years. What we're really excited about is that when you applied this framework, like you said, it's a potentially unifying framework, which is a really exciting thing. It's also what researchers in this field get the most flack for, because nobody wants something that solves everything. Because if it's too easy, then there's probably a problem, right?
Right.
You don't want it to sort of satisfy everything. But I've definitely drank the Kool-Aid. I think it probably really is a unifying theory. And so the interesting thing was to look at a couple of different pathologies, and we kept coming up with the same.
Yes.
Part of the same story kept arising every time we looked at what seemingly looked like different psychopathologies. And one of the shared characteristics that I think is very interesting, especially when you're thinking about what is happiness and what is well-being and what is flourishing, I think this might actually give us a little bit of a hint, is we kept, in all of our papers, we kept finding ourselves saying, well, the problem is that some pathological belief set gets installed, and there's a couple of different ways it can be installed, and then it insulates itself from updating.
Yes.
So it gets installed, it's non-adaptive, and non-adaptive belief set gets installed, and then it insulates itself from update. And as soon as you have that sticky bad belief set, then you have a system that, given enough time, starts going out of sync. It starts deviating from the way the world actually is. And the more that it deviates, of course, that's the more error it's experiencing. And now we're starting to think pervasive error is felt negatively. It feels bad to be positioned in increasing error experiences. So it's the sticky bad belief set that we've been pretty interested in thinking about.
Belief, and
exactly.
And so let's explore. Let's really dig deep, because if that underlies what you're talking about with PTSD, for example, or depersonalization or addictions or compulsions, if that's kind of an underlying or common thread, digging deeper in that is going to help us then understand each of those psychopathologies.
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit more about, so you're saying it stops. So one is, how did it get there? And the other question is, in this framework, error drives updating, right? If you don't update, then you get stuck, is what you're saying. And you start imposing your version of the world onto the world, right? The one you expect onto the world.
Exactly.
And when you say these beliefs are so pervasive, that's what they tend to be doing, right? In PTSD, you are seeing almost that reality taking place in front of you, like this. I think of it as a reality illusion. But your symptoms and your response make sense in that illusion, right?
It's such, you're right onto it. You're right onto it. That's exactly what we're thinking. So, for instance, with PTSD, okay, you're in a war zone and the world is extremely volatile. Yeah, you've got all sorts of critical, highly important volatility in your environment. There's violence and uncertainty and government changes. I mean, it is a really volatile environment. So if you stay somewhere where there's a high amount of volatility for a long enough duration of time, one of the things that looks like it happens is the system builds a high-level belief network that says the world is a volatile place.
Yeah, and when you say
it then uses those.
When you're saying volatile, you're talking life risk, right? You're talking threat to the organism, to the person, right? This is a big prediction error.
An important one, like an evolutionarily important one, right?
Very evolutionary important. Yeah. These are wired deep into our brain, into our being, right? So
exactly. So given enough time, the system actually installs a high-level belief about the volatility, and that's a good thing, because what that means is the system is now expecting the world to be dangerous, and because it expects the world to be dangerous, it's turning the volume up on any little micro signals about danger. That's how you stay alive in a war zone. You turn the volume up on micro danger signals. That's what makes you a good soldier.
And Mark, can I just then dig into that? Because
please,
if you're turning up that volume, so what you're saying is this PTSD is actually the brain responding the way it's meant to in that environment, right? It's actually responding naturally and normally according to how the prediction error and how that prediction system would work. So a lot of people do think of PTSD or some of these other issues that are going to have the similar characteristics as psychopathology, as something going wrong, but you're saying the brain is actually going right. Yeah, it's learning what noises are important, what senses are important, what feelings in the body. Yeah, it's learning all those, and it's making high priority on those, as you said, turning up the gain. So, you know, in this model, you can see the brain going right in terms of, in that environment, it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have to be just a touch careful because we don't want to exhaust any one pathology just by sort of creating just a really simple reductionist framework for it. But what you're saying there is something we're really interested in looking at, which is you have a brain that's built for optimization, and there's lots of ways that it seems to start acting suboptimally. But if you look closely, actually it is working optimally. It's working optimally in a particular niche. And so for instance, the big fat amygdala that soldiers get when they're, you know, people that are in these sorts of areas, in the war zone. I mean, that is it's an adaptive feature of the brain. The brain has decided to turn the volume up on danger signal. It's totally adaptive. So then what's pathological about it? Well, we think that primarily what's pathological about it is when a soldier leaves that environment and they come back somewhere where it's no longer adaptive, but the system stays insulated. It doesn't update. And there's lots of reasons. I mean, that's what we're interested in looking at now, is what actually freezes these belief sets. And I think there's going to be a couple of different stories.
That's going to be fascinating.
But we can definitely see this. I mean, you know, a family member of mine came back from war, and he came back with a lot of emotional challenges and cognitive challenges. And he filled his time with watching war movies and playing war video games and talking about war with his friends. And that filled up like most of his time. So this theory, it makes obvious to me why that might have happened, because you have these high level predictions to be in danger, and then they're staying installed. And rather than those being updated and replaced by peacetime predictions, instead what the system did was, for whatever reason, that got insulated. And then the system started to try to test the world in order to make the world, because, you know, there's another way you can get rid of error. If the model doesn't want to update, you just change the world to better fit the model. So now just surround yourself with war stimuli. And that's one of the ways you can get a good predictive grip again. So it's an optimizing system working the way it's meant to, but you can see where there's a breakdown.
And Mark, just to link this now, because you've described it beautifully in terms of PTSD. If you think about childhood, adverse childhood experience and childhood trauma, where we're wired for connection, we're wired for attachment and belonging, we're wired to be able to express ourselves, and that sometimes there's come into conflict in the environment that you grow up in. But now you can start to see that same framework, those same ideas, that same insulating belief happen as a child. And now as a child, you might learn that a certain behavior leads to your carer rejecting you, or humiliating you, or criticizing you, or controlling you, or doing something to modify that behavior. And the brain in this childhood state learns that wiring and adapts that wiring. So those beliefs, as you said, those then become insulated also and carried into adulthood. And they can then lead to people, like you said, you then put yourself in that environment again, whether it's abuse or, whether it's some sort of adverse experience. It's just the brain changing the world to meet those expectations that have come from that early childhood experience, right? So can you see how those link, right?
Yeah, these strange loops are everywhere in this framework. So the thing you believe is the thing that you try to make or encounter, which enforces the belief, which changes the way you sample, which changes the belief, which changes the way you sample. And it works for worse and it works for better. So depression is a self-fueling, self-generating, dynamical system. Depression works very much in a similar way. Lots of good research right now on predictive processing.
What sort of beliefs then go into something like depression, for example?
Well, there's good research on this. So anybody who's listening, it's definitely worth looking into if you want to look. I mean, there's lots of great work out now on this. We have a paper on this as well. I can give you the link after. And our sort of opening bid was to think about if somebody is living again in a volatile environment where they're just not able to get a good predictive grip, homelessness, pain, chronic pain.
It could be like a breakup, for example, right, Mark? You go through a breakup or a loss of a job, and that creates an intense pain. And pain is almost a prediction error as well, right? And
of course, yeah, because the body expects to have integrity.
To feel
so
good.
Yeah. So if you damage the body, then that's a breach. That's a breach. And it's, it's a bit funny to say expectation, because don't confuse here that the body has beliefs, but we do talk about it like the body has beliefs. The body has certain long-term expectations of the states that it tends to inhabit to keep it alive, right? And those are integrity states.
Yes,
exactly.
And so what you're saying, so then extended pain, chronic pain, breakup, those things, he's saying those sort of then create a pain system that then a person in depression or person then creates beliefs around.
Right. So we thought the viciousness comes when, if you've had persistent volatility, usually what happens when we have like an increase, an unexpected increase in volatility, is we task switch. We go and we do something else, or we step back.
Right.
So look, there's always going to be a bandwidth of the errors that you can digest.
Right.
If it's too volatile, then you should stay away from it. But you also kind of want to stay away from the too boring bits. And that's coming up a little bit in our work right now. There's a kind of Goldilocks zone where we like to reduce errors. We like to find those errors that are reducible, easily reducible, given our skill set.
So these are things we can learn or things we can do. We feel a degree of competency, right? And
exactly.
if we start to lose that competency, for example, learning a new skill or in our world, not being able to do our world or our job or have a relationship, a competency and a version of competency goes, right? We lose that.
Right.
What you're saying, like the valence that then arises from the frustration, those sort of emotions that tell us the grip on the world has been lost.
Yes, exactly. So let me just take it one step and then we'll go to the next. So if you're learning a new skill, like a new instrument, and it's really challenging, or let's say you try a song that's too hard, the frustration that you're getting is informing the system that you're not improving in the instrument in the ways that you'd be expecting to, given how fast you've improved in the past. That's really valuable information. So it's good to be frustrated. Like, it's good to get bored. It's good to be frustrated. That's good information for the system, telling you where your skill sets lie. Now, what in an adaptive system that should do is it should signal the system to turn its confidence down on those kinds of behaviors and maybe turn them up on other behaviors, like going back to scales. So now you're back on your scales because that song was too hard, but you don't want to go back to just things you already know, because then there's no good errors to resolve. And so you don't get any of the positive affect that you get from resolving errors better than expected. So that's all good information. The problem is, though, when you get an unexpected rise in volatility, which comes with some suffering, that you can't task switch away from. Right. Now we're getting into a place,
a breakup or traumatic event, loss of a
chronic
job.
pain. Chronic pain is such a good one.
Chronic pain, any of those
you
things.
Can't turn away. Like so you're in pain when you do this, so then you try to do something else and you're in pain there. So you turn somewhere else and you're still in pain there. So you go somewhere else and now you're pain over there.
Yes.
So what's happening is you're learning.
Yeah.
Here's the nastiness. Yeah. You're learning that the models that you have of the world are not allowing you to get a good predictive grip on the sort of volatility that you're experiencing.
Right. You're not able to reduce the error. You're not able to account for it. You're not able to deal with it. Right. So now you're getting this nasty high level belief installed that says, this isn't working. All these things are not valid. They're not adaptive anymore. You are not an adaptive thing in this environment. Right. Here's the nasty bit. Yeah, right. Learned helplessness is what we're talking about here, really, right? You got a high level belief about learned helplessness. Yeah, there's nothing I can do. Now, here's the nasty bit. As soon as that high level belief is installed, then the system begins trying to confirm it, because that's just the kind of thing that a predictive system does. That's the expectation, right? Yeah. That's right. So now it's making an expectation that the world is unmanageable. So what does it do?
it cranks the volume up on all of the unmanageable stimuli, and it turns the volume down on anything that you're capable of doing.
And Mark, this is fascinating, because when I've worked with clients on things, and we run into these things, when you free them. So what you see in this is actually, you're talking about the world, but you're talking about even their memories that are available, are filtered. The senses that they feel are filtered, right? This is a whole system, the whole being is filtered into this version of the world. It's not that they are choosing to be there. Their brain is actually driving that based on those experiences.
Let's go back to our very first point. The world we experience is generated from the top down. That's the world. That's the world you experience. Like, that's the power. That's, for better or for worse, that's the power of the framework. That's what the framework is suggesting, is that you experience the world that you expect.
Right.
So that is actually the world they experience.
And the amazing thing, so when we work with clients and when we free those things, when we free those high level beliefs, we free those, what you see now is these other memories pour through.
Yeah.
And these ones that used to have these old ways of, this old interpretation suddenly get seen as a new light, and it happens within minutes. Yeah, it's amazing. And new memories that confirm this other world actually just burst out spontaneously.
There was a really nice study that's nice to bring up here. They did a study where they took people who had like chronic major depression, like proper clinical level major depression, not a dip in mood, but long-term major depression. And they asked them, how much of the day are you depressed? And they say, all day. I wake up depressed. I'm depressed all day. I go to bed depressed. Like, I'm depressed every minute of every day. And then they gave them beepers. Yeah. And then they did a longitudinal study where they beeped them randomly and got them to write in a journal what their affective tone was, what they were doing, how they were feeling right then. And they found, I can't remember the exact numbers, but they found like they were actually only actively depressed 10 or 12% of the day. Yes. The rest of the time they're either neutral or positive.
Yes.
But when they were saying their experience, it had not registered. It didn't get encoded. It was as if the 12% made up the whole.
Mark, let's jump on that word encoded, because when you say encoded, what's getting encoded? These memories, right? The memories are getting dialed up. The memories of the times when I was depressed, they're the ones that get dialed up in the brain and pay attention to, right? And this is what you see when you encounter these people and you work with them as clients. So that encoding, the memory system is all dialed into that system as well. It's all working as one whole unit, right? So
exactly.
So what we're saying in this framework is that the brain is working as it should. Yeah. It's working as a predictive brain would, but it's creating these issues because of the way these things have become insulated. Yeah.
So now here's what I'd like to ask you. So if that's the case, then it seems to us that the way to begin now, I just want to add a caveat here that there's lots of ways that these things can get installed and can get insulated. And that's still very much an active research project. Yeah. For instance, with addictive substances, they act specifically on the neural hardware as if these toggles are working, as if certain beliefs are more powerful, like the drug taking and seeking behaviors are super good ways to get to where you want to go. Right. I just want to leave that for a second though. Yep. There's lots of ways that these beliefs can get installed, and there's lots of ways they can get insulated. There's probably going to be a biophysical story for insulation here. And there's also going to be like lots of social and cultural dynamics that are at play. But whatever the case, it seems to be one way that we could start moving towards health again is to have enough metacognition in the system that we begin to identify where the bad belief sets are that are frozen, and then to start jeopardizing those belief sets by giving counter evidence to the system, because the system is optimizing. The system wants to be well in a way. It wants to update optimally.
It really
does. So what you have to do is you have to locate where the bad belief is that's insulated. And then you have to give this really subtle optimizing system the kind of data that runs counter to the frozen belief. And I suspect that's the kind of thing that you're talking about that you do in your practice.
Absolutely, Mike. Yeah. And look, there's a whole host of different ways of working with this, but they all make sense. Once you shift into the prediction system, once you become aware of this prediction system, and that a belief, we're talking about beliefs, but actually these beliefs, they're actually grounded in deep sets of learning and memory, right? They're not just a belief on the side.
No, it's not like, oh, I believe that, so don't be depressed. You're like, no, that doesn't help because it's deeply encoded.
Deeply encoded, massive memories that have been dialed up that support it, right? These are powerful interoceptive experiences in the body of biochemistry that tells you are depressed, right?
Yeah.
And so that then goes with the inference. I am depressed. I feel it in my body. I need to explain why I feel it. I must be depressed, right? So these things go together. There's a feedback or feed forward, like a circular causality, right? So the expectation of being depressed creates a feeling of being depressed. The feeling of being depressed is different from what your body wants to experience as optimal health and flourishing. And so the brain has to explain that through the inferencing process, right? It's a sense, interoception is a sense. It has to explain why it has that sense. And it has a top down that goes, oh yeah, volatile world, there's been a lot of pain, I'm depressed. And so those two kind of meet. Now, as soon as you become aware that they're held in these neural networks in the brain, this prediction system and the link to the body, as soon as you're aware of that, you move into a model now where you no longer need to manage so much. You don't need to medicate or suppress symptoms. Because if you move into this model, what it shows, if you work with this framework, you know the synapses are holding the learning and the inferences, the inferencing system, the active inferences. We haven't really talked about that, but this expectations. If you know that, you can go in and get this system to activate. And when you do, as you said, as you provide evidence counter in this system, but the person almost embodying these other possibilities, you start to then be able to question that evidence from within, from the brain sees that it's actually predicted this thing itself, and there's an amazing technique. I think the Lefko belief change, he uses the idea the brain has put this in itself, and when the brain can see that, it actually lets go of it. It's amazing. It's fantastic. Bruce Ecker, the coherence therapy, he talks about this. Once you find this neural network holding the learning and holding the inferencing together, when you provide the prediction error and the errors that go with that question that and change the meaning and change the reaction, the symptoms and issues just start to vanish. That belief, that insulated just goes, oh, we don't need it anymore. And it so symptoms of depression. I've heard of stories where alcoholism turned around in a 90-minute session, and depression lifted. So, I work with clients, anxiety lifted in 20 minutes. Once you start to work with this system, and this is why, Mark, I'm so happy to have you here and describe this system for these people to understand, because once they get this, these techniques and these ideas make sense. You move to a new model of working with the brain. So thank you so much for hacking this, Mark. And what were you going to say?
Yeah, you're very welcome, Bob. What you say there is really interesting. So in depression, where you have a high level belief about volatility, you could almost think about a counter on the positive end, which is you start to install a high level belief that says, these are just belief systems.
Yes.
They're always relative.
Yes.
They are changeable.
Yes.
They are just your system trying its best to be adaptive, but failing.
Yes.
And you can imagine, if you have a high enough level belief installed that says beliefs are always updatable.
Yes.
Think about how much more powerful your experiences are in the world. And I suspect if you're doing meditation correctly, this is one of the things that you're trying to achieve, especially in the Buddhist paradigm. You are systematically looking at your own experience and you're seeing, well, look, there's a place where I held strongly onto a belief, and you look at it really closely and then it starts wiggling and it starts wobbling and it starts flowing. You go, look, it too was impermanent. It didn't stay. Look at my anxiety, and you're really mindful of your panic attack arc, and you realize panic attacks never go on forever. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've had panic attacks in the past. And the thing that's most debilitating about them is that in the moment, the body feels like this is going to go on forever. This is going to go up. I'm never going to get out of this now.
Yes.
If I could come to you, magically and say, Tony, listen, your panic attack is going to last 16 minutes, and I give you a stopwatch and you could hold it, it would be, the suffering of it would be cut into a third, I'm sure, because I would just go, okay, let's go, 16 minutes, but it doesn't feel like that. But if your system could learn,
it feels like it's going to continue, right? That's part of
exactly.
the prediction. Yeah,
exactly. But if you could learn that this has a natural arc,
yeah,
then that's a huge game change. Or like again, like we were saying, like if you start really looking at your experience, you say I'm depressed, you start really looking at your experience, and then you notice that actually depression is made up of these different phenomenological sets, and in fact they come and go. They come, sometimes they're there, and sometimes they pass, and sometimes they're back. Right away, you're already jeopardizing that belief that the world is stuck in some way. It's not stuck in one way. Look at it. Look at it turning on, turning off,
yeah.
turning on, turning off.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So what you're saying is once you raise your awareness, so that filter of that insulated belief is affecting the memories you're encoding. It's affecting the way you're seeing the world and what you're dialing up. But what you're saying through the contemplative pathways, and you're beginning to now see a bigger picture, right? Beyond that expectation.
Exactly.
Beyond how that framework is actually happening. And you talked about transparency, right, before.
Yeah. And I love this because, like a podcast like this then could really be, it's a substantial first step. I mean, what we're doing is we're inviting listeners to reflect on their experience, saying, look, by the way, if you didn't know, your experience is self-created in some important way.
Yes.
And if that's the case, you should look really closely at it and see if it really is the way you think it is, because it might not be. And if you look closely enough, persistently enough, you might find a world that you didn't expect to be there. And that's the same thing. I think that's a very good, it's a very good suggestion. If you're in pain, actually look at the pain, see if it's the way you expect it to be or not.
Yeah, I love that. I love that invitation, Mark. I love that invitation now, just to consider, okay, if this framework, does sort of explain what's going on in this experience, now understanding that allows you to step back that little bit and go, as you talked about in the past, I'm co-creating this world. What's my role in this? And begin to sort of question and see that. And let's use that now to move us now towards how do we look at now flourishing? How do we look at well-being and thriving in this framework? What does it represent? And you've already started to mention these high-level beliefs. Yeah, how do we now start to look at those high-level beliefs as now helping us to explain the prediction error or account for that or dial again in some way, that we can now live with this experience? How can you tell us a little about that, Mark?
Yeah, actually, so let's see. So we've just written a paper, The Predictive Dynamics of Happiness and Wellbeing, and it's our first crack at this. And there isn't much research on this right now. I'm actually organizing a special collection in neuroscience of consciousness that'll be out next year, that's bringing together the whole active inference community, lots of the big players in the active inference community, to write on the topic of well-being.
Fantastic.
On consciousness.
I look forward to that.
So we're really excited for it. We've got 15 paper submissions, and we've got some just banging people on the collection. I think it's gonna be a really great collection. But we're just sort of just dipping our toe into the water now, so we haven't gone far in. So anybody who's listening to this, who's a researcher, this is a place that's really ripe. It's ripe for investigation. Our first step towards thinking about happiness and well-being, flourishing, was in a way what I've already said. If pathology shares this characteristic of a sort of maladaptive belief set that's insulated in some way from updating, then one of the things that's going to potentially underwrite long-term flourishing, long-term well-being, are the sorts of self-organizing patterns that prevent that kind of insulation, that prevent this kind of sticky bad belief resistance to updating. So what would the sort of counter example of that be? And I think we already touched a little bit on it, starting to install sort of high-level beliefs about the nature of your own beliefs is like a really good step. Right. I think it's a really good step in that direction.
Yeah. And what would an example of that be, Mark?
So what do you mean? So ask again.
So a high-level belief about my belief. So that, a high-level belief that, the world is
right. So
I'm accepting it.
Sort of like
acceptance and
Right. Sort of like what I'd said a moment ago is, I think, a really good example of this, which is like having a high level belief installed that your beliefs are changeable, or that your
Yes.
beliefs
Okay.
are only
Yeah.
beliefs,
Yes.
or that the way that you experience the world is only a top-down, it's importantly a top-down prediction. That's a really important thing to know.
Yeah.
So if you knew that your experience was based on your beliefs, and your beliefs are always updatable, they're never going to be a perfect fit.
Yes.
Then just imagine the difference in the way that you would go about gaining data. And I think if we look at some of the big issues we see in the world today, we're seeing a lot of issues around people lock into believing the world is one way.
Yeah.
And then they cease updating.
Yes.
Right. And then they just go to the world to try to collect evidence for the thing they already believe. I mean, this is where we're getting conspiracy theories and filter bubbles from, is this sort of maladaptive approach. So you need to reduce prediction error. That's the modus operandi of the system. But the way that it can do it is, one thing it can do is it can just lock down and then stick itself in little niches where it's only going to get that evidence. And that's just not a very adaptive way to live. The alternative is to know that these are just beliefs and to be willing to update relative to new evidence. I think that's nice. I think it's really a nice place to start.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk about those, is it super forecasters or something? So
yeah, exactly.
Have high level beliefs installed that the world is a changeable place. Beliefs are changeable. There's always evidence on both sides, and sort of weighing it up. And this, I think, kind of links into well-being and happiness, right? That not putting all your eggs in one belief basket, but actually being open to go, look, I could be wrong here. And when I work with clients, Mark, the biggest shifts they get is once they have beliefs installed that it's okay to fail, it's okay to make a mistake, because I don't get rejected, or I don't lose status. You know, I learn and grow, and I actually get stuff from this, right? And when I work with clients and they install these beliefs, when we work with them to actually free the fear of the rejection and free the fear of the shame, you know, they move from always needing to be right, which is what you're saying, putting their word, but to actually going, wow, I can be wrong, and I can take on someone else's view, and I can have an argument with my partner in a beautiful, you know, listening way, just by having that belief. It's okay to make a mistake. Yeah, it's okay.
Tony, it's such a good point. And I mean, this is a nice, good final point. You're right. In addition to having a high level belief installed in the system that your beliefs are updatable, this like reorienting our experience of negativity, changing the way that the system experiences prediction error, changing our beliefs about volatility is huge. You know, and I love that, like you're saying, like when you start to learn that actually, this is another thing you get in meditation, right? You start learning that negative affect isn't something you need to run from as soon as it turns on, that it has a shelf life. If you could just be cool, if you just be cool, it'll rise and fall in time, and it will be fine. But actually that takes updating. You've got to learn how to model your own experiences. I mean, that's just emotion regulation stuff. So valuable, so important.
Absolutely, Mark. And look, that's a beautiful way to finish now, where we're starting to see how we can use these beliefs to improve our experience and now create a different expectation of our world and ourselves, right? And Mark, I just want to thank you for everything you've done for the show today. It's just been wonderful to have the opportunity to have this discussion with you, for you to share your experience, and you've looked across all these pathologies and dynamics of well-being, and there's so much I know you're still to bring through the research. And just want to ask you this question to finish, Mark, but now if you can achieve one thing with this, with sharing this framework with people, you can achieve one thing in the world, and I know you've just got a position in Monash that might be allowing you to do this. What would that be? What would you want to make the difference in the world? What's the difference you want to make in the world using this knowledge, being aware of this?
One thing that I'm really interested in is thinking about how we can take these theories out of the armchair and off of the drawing board and put them into practice. See what we can actually do to have better minds, to learn about why emotional regulation works the way it does, and not just to explain it, not just as an explanatory framework, but using those explanations to actually improve the way that we practice cognitive improvement, emotional regulation. So like you were saying, the position at Monash University, it's at their fantastic new Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. And it's really a department that's dedicated to looking at how we can take these cognitive frameworks and actually use them to fuel practices that actually help people be better. So that's the whole gig. So
Wonderful.
that's the dream.
And what you're saying is Monash now has just opened a whole new department. Based on this framework that we're talking about throughout, right? And elements of this framework. Is that right? And
well, the framework doesn't exhaust the center. The center is really big and it's diverse. But we do have some we have some core researchers who are working on this theory and thinking about its applicability to things like meditation. So that's it's really exciting.
Oh, wonderful. I look forward to seeing what comes out of that, Mark. And if people can keep track of that, I think you've got a podcast now. Do you want to tell us?
I do. We've got a new podcast. Exactly. We've got a podcast called the Contemplative Science Podcast. Exactly. So what we're doing is we're inviting neuroscientists and monks and practitioners of all ilks, and we bring them together, and then we're talking about where science and contemplative practices meet in all sorts of interesting ways. So you can find us at the contemplativescientist.com there.
Wonderful. And that's going to inform a lot of this. So thank you so much, Mark, for this wonderful time with us. And
thanks, Tony.
Thank you for joining us and sharing that today.
Thanks so much.